Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Half-Life Special Edition video. Well, I teased this the other day on the comment tab and then also on my Facebook page. With regards to this, I just saw a very nice documentary that was produced, it looks like by a group that were Patreon funded, and they started a topic there for the entire documentary about the rise and fall of Half-Life. It all has to do with basically the 20-year anniversary associated with Half-Life. And so seeing this documentary, which was fantastic, by the way, I'm going to include the link for it below. It's pretty much free to watch there on YouTube, so be sure to check it out when you have a chance, especially if you're a fan on Half-Life. But seeing the documentary, I thought to myself, this is actually very inspiring. I wanted to go ahead and create my own video here about Half-Life 20 years later, and then focus on some topics that are more personal on my end. So this is more associated essentially on my standpoint as opposed to an overall standpoint. Like, for example, I'll talk about when I first saw Half-Life, how I first got it, why I feel it was a success, why no more Half-Life 3, and so forth. And then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on everything too. But first off, when you have a chance, please check out that Half-Life link, the rise and fall of Half-Life. It's absolutely phenomenal. And then hopefully you'll be able to see why it's still a very important game to this very day. So, all right, let's go ahead and let's talk about this, in this case, my own Half-Life thoughts 20 years later. So, when did I first see Half-Life? Well, it was a funny thing because it seems like the main basis, like the main thing that follows lots of people is it's always a friend introducing people to Half-Life. So it's always somebody saying, "Hey, check out this game," and then that's essentially how it grew from there. Like, it was almost like an instant word of mouth, a viral stance back then before things were considered viral. That's how it happened to me. That's how I first heard and saw about Half-Life. A friend of mine, he introduced me to it. He stated, "Come, go join my house, and I'll show you this fantastic game that I just got." If I had to guess, I think it was like in the late 1998, like the end of the months, or maybe early 1999, when I was first introduced to it. So I went to his house. He turned on his computer, and then he started to play the game from scratch. It made it seem like he had already played it completely, but he wanted to show me this game for the very first time, and I was instantly hooked. Like, essentially, as the credits were playing, those infamous credits, the very famous credits that to this day everyone remembers that first time, that's essentially how it introduced me, and I was just hooked from then. And it is a great success when it comes to those opening credits, because it's introducing you to the entire world within Half-Life, but it's doing it in a way that you are being immersed in it. You're not essentially being forced to go through all this stuff. No, you're actually wandering around, looking around, seeing all these neat little things like scientists walking back and forth, machines holding these large crates. You're seeing connections being done on the tram or whatever type of train that you're on, and you have to wait too, like as connections hook up from one another. It makes it far more realistic. You got to see helicopters taking off, you got to see what looked like radioactive pools in some places, and the area around it, of course, looked all very cool, very, very creepy almost, because it had to do with a decommissioned silo, an underground silo that was turned, in this case, to Black Mesa. All that stuff within the first couple of minutes was absolutely fantastic. Like I said, I was just hooked. So once I saw the game and it finished with the credits, then I saw my friend play it as you took on the first person perspective of Gordon Freeman, and then you got to see the accident, you got to see those creatures start to come about, you got to see the scientists running frantically, and then you joining them to try to help them, and then finally the soldiers coming out. I think that was about as far as I got at that point, when the first set of soldiers started to appear, and then that's when I had to go for that day. But ever since then, ever since that time, I thought to myself, I'm going to absolutely get this game soon. The only thing was, though, I didn't have if I recall correctly, I didn't have a computer at that point, so I decided to finally get one. And it took a little while, but I had to save up my money, bit by bit. At the time, I was working at a fast food place because this was when I was younger at the time. And so I was able to save up my money. And I finally got a nice computer, nice to me at least, there at Best Buy. It was an E-Machines 466. Never forget it. I still have it to this day, in fact, stored in my closet. But it was my very first computer, and I decided then to also upgrade just a little bit. I remember getting an ATI All-in-Wonder Pro PCI card that I installed myself there too, so that way I could finally work on video games afterwards. So I got all that done, added a little bit more RAM on there too. I think at the time it was boasting like a quote unquote wonderful 25 megabytes of RAM. Like that's how much the computers needed back then. But yes, I finally got all that installed, and then I went to an old CompUSA. Anybody remember those stores before they closed down? I went there and I got two games. I got the Half-Life Game of the Year edition because at that point I think it was like a year old, and so it was celebrating its success, and it released a newer version called the Game of the Year edition. And I also got an Alien versus Predator Gold Edition game as well. So I still remember that too because I didn't spend money lightly at that point. Like it was basically it's pick and choose what I had to spend money on because I didn't have much. I had very little back then. So I was able to pick those two games, and those were my introductions games to my PC. And then of course I put on Half-Life, and the rest is history. So I was finally able to play it from the beginning all the way to the end, and it was just amazing. Just absolutely fantastic game all the way to the end when you finally got to Zen, and then of course the mysterious ending with the G-Man. It totally enveloped me in that world, and I loved every minute of it, and I was looking forward to everything else that would happen in the world of Half-Life thereafter. But that's essentially how I first got into Half-Life, and then how I was able to finally just play it there too. If any of you, by the way, have any of your own comments, how you first got into Half-Life, who introduced you, it's always going to be somebody, right? Some friend that introduced you, because again, that's the telltale sign with Half-Life. Then please post those comments, share them with everyone if you have a chance. Now I'm going to segue into why I feel 20 years later Half-Life is still such a success, like why it started off strong and why it continues to be a success, even if to this day there hasn't been an official sequel or an official side game for over a decade now. In this case, I'm going to give my own reasons, my own personal reasons for it. The biggest one, of course, ties into the opening credits. Right off the bat, you knew that you're dealing with something different, something just utterly amazing, just absolutely original. It seems simple, right? Like when it comes to the stuff that the game had, how it seems so groundbreaking, and it makes you wonder, like, why didn't I think of that before? Like, I'm pretty sure a lot of developers were thinking of that too. But it seems so simple, like sliced bread, but it was the first one to basically embrace such a strong story. Those opening credits made it seem that as you were reading the history of Black Mesa and as you were reading the history of Gordon Freeman, you knew that story was going to be a strong emphasis for the entire game. And it's true. Everything was focusing on the story. You got to see everything happening there to Black Mesa, and then you got to go slowly but surely peel away like an onion, see more of the history associated with, especially when the G-Man was first introduced, and then you got to delve into some more, I guess, not files, but more layers into that backstory, and then of course when the military were introduced, that was another segue of the story, because now all of a sudden you were in a different part, you were becoming more of an enemy as opposed to now the hero within the game, which was kind of ironic too as well. And then of course everything just blew wide open when you went into Zen, and it embraced the story there, all of it involving original looking monsters, original creatures, and then some of the ways you had to deal with them as well. All of that just completely just tied into a very strong hook, which was the story. Which, by the way, the reason for, I believe, it also is success too with the story is it's all based on The Mist, that very popular novella from Stephen King. In fact, I'm watching right now the Mist series, the one that debuted, was it a year ago or so, on TV. I'm finally catching up on it on Netflix, and it's really, really good. I've already read the novella. I've listened to the audiobook too. If you haven't had a chance, please do so. It is a great, great way. It's a great story, and it's a great way to segue into Half-Life. And then, of course, there's the movie as well, which is also really good. But yes, Half-Life is based on The Mist. In fact, when it was being developed, its code name was Quiver, which is itself based off Project Arrowhead, which was somewhat featured within the novella. Project Arrowhead being that mysterious military scientific organization that was doing some kind of experiments that ended up bringing the mist into this world, and with it all those horrific monsters. So you see right away that they're linked, in other words, here, because here you have Black Mesa and the scientists doing all these experiments, and you're part of it, and you in turn help bring this Zen, whatever it is, with these portals coming in this case the mist being the equivalency of these portals, and creating all these monsters. So all of that is of course filled with even more mystery, with more backstory, like why that was happening in the first place, who is the G-Man, what was his involvement with it, ending with the mystery of an open-ended way, like where you're basically placed into bases. All that stuff is the same thing as The Mist, so that's why I felt it was also a good success. Everyone mentions, of course, the great puzzles that the game had, which is true, because a lot of times I was banging my head thinking, how am I going to get off of this particular level? It doesn't look like there's anything readily apparent, and then you finally figure it out, and it makes it so satisfying to do so. There's no mindless action in this game. I mean, there are certain points where you're just finally just blazing your machine gun towards aliens left and right, but it's very tiny spots. It's most of the time it's stealth. It's moving from place to place as quiet as possible. It's trying to make sure that you could almost like ambush certain enemies, and then also these puzzles that tie into it. And then lastly, the build up that tied to it too, because you go from a tiny crowbar to then working with more like a handgun, and then more powerful armory, and then dealing with scientists, to the security, to finally the soldiers, to the assassins, to the Zen monsters, then the big boss, of course, at the end. All of that was a great build up, but none of it involving that mindless action. So that's why it left you wanting more, because at no point did you ever get bored. Everything was a great, fantastic build up too. And then also I think it was a great success because, as I mentioned earlier, with word of mouth, Valve openly embraced all these mods, and it was true. The documentary highlights a good portion of it too. On their feature, you get to see how they allowed people to work on the game themselves, and they would encourage it with all these downloadable contents, or whatever the equivalency was back then, especially on the multiplayer stuff. And then that way people would in turn give feedback. They would say this works or this sucks, and then that way the only the good stuff would float towards the top. So all that stuff just continued to have good success. In fact, that's how that great game, the Counter-Strike, eventually came to play too, which shows why it was success after success. And then another thing too, at least on my end, and I was kind of scared at this at first, but then I realized how wonderful it was. Remember that E-Machine that I was mentioning earlier, the E-Machine 466, which had like originally 10 megabytes of RAM, and then I upgraded it to 25, and then I added that ATI All-in-Wonder Pro, which added another 10 megabytes just for video processing. I was scared at the time because I thought that the game was going to be too advanced for me, like for my computer. Like it was going to be just lagging left and right. But no, once I put it on, there was this great feature. I think it was called OpenGL, something like that. And when you clicked it, then it could use something in there to make it more user-friendly on computers. And that's why I felt it was a great success, because it allowed the game to be played more on a consumer level. What I mean is this: I look at some of the games today, like that what is it called, that Red Dead Redemption, something like that, or Fallout, and I look at the games on YouTube, and I watch the playthroughs, and I'm thinking, my God, I mean, this stuff is just so out there when it comes to the graphics, that if you have a regular computer, and I mean like a regular office computer, something like that, you would have no way of playing these games. Like, this stuff would just be lagging so much, it would be unplayable. You have to have a high standard computer these days focused on video games specifically in order to do so. But back then, no, Half-Life made it pretty much on any standard computer, even on mine. And mine wasn't state of the art. It was just piecemealed with things that I would add here and there to try to upgrade it a little bit. But the game ran smoothly. That allowed it to go on a mass consumer level. That allowed it to gain a good number of people that were played, and then they would share it with others, and it would just grow from there. It's kind of like when you don't think about it, it makes sense though, like how things work today. Because it's something you wouldn't think about, like when it comes to focusing on the mass level. But yes, in this case, that's why I feel it hit off well back then. So now let's talk about the last topic. In this case, why no more Half-Life? It ties into that documentary with the rise and fall, specifically the fall of Half-Life. And I think it's true what the documentary states. Valve has essentially moved on. Everything else in their world is on the forefront. They don't have Half-Life as a die-hard, we need to do things, putting it on spreadsheets, getting it done on a timeline sort of stuff. No, in this case, everything else in their world is much more important. And in fact, the documentary has a point where it's almost like to them it's more like a meh, like we'll focus on it, but it's kicking the can down the line. And a perfect example was with the upcoming 20-year anniversary. It would have been a great time to have something focused on it. Even a tiny thing like at a presentation where one of the guys there was asking, "Hey, can I have the G-Man come out and say hello to everyone on a video screen just to thank everyone for their continued fan base for Half-Life 20 years later?" And the word that he got back was, "Yeah, we could do that, but we have to find the coding for the G-Man, and it's just lost somewhere, so it's not really something on the forefront that they want to do." That instantly reminded me of Konami and the way they feel about Silent Hill. Like, for example, there's the idea of Silent Hill. Why not just do the first game all over again? Make it available for Steam, or make it available for newer generations. But the idea is all that stuff is lost, and there's no emphasis on trying to find it because it involves effort, and nobody really wants to go towards that effort. That's the biggest thing that I felt is impacting Half-Life. It's going to take effort, but at the same time, why bother when there's other things that they're focusing on? And it's kind of sad when you think about it, but that's essentially where Half-Life stands in their world. I could be wrong. Who knows? All this stuff could be in secret, where they have a major project, and all of a sudden this year it could come out, and it's Half-Life 3 all of a sudden. But no, I don't think that's the case. I think it's truly, if it would have happened, it would have happened by now. And by this point, it's almost like awkward to do so, because it's almost like bringing something back from over 10 years ago that was popular, but now an entire generation has moved on from it. A whole new generation is here, and people, the newer generation, would be like, "Oh, it seems kind of lame to have something come back all of a sudden, trying to make itself popular when it was back then, but now it isn't." So it's just like moving past its prime. So also another reason I feel is because there are such bad, I guess, like hardcore fans and also gaming reviews that are more clickbait articles. The documentary focused on that too, and there was another thing about Postal that I was one time reading on from the CEO, some guy named Desi on there, where he was stating this too, where it's almost like gaming reviews these days are more about clickbait articles. It's about finding the biggest way to sell something that'll people will click on to read. Are people going to click on more positive stuff, or are they going to click on more negative stuff? Like, instead of an article stating this game is great, people aren't going to click on that. But if someone posts an article that says this game sucks and here's why, people are going to click on that. So why go through all that essentially to have 3 to 4 years to build a game, spend $10 million plus for it, only to essentially run into a bunch of gaming reviews that'll be more focused on clickbait articles? That's just my opinion on there, but it was emphasized also in the documentary, and then also within some of the other examples I just gave. Especially just too, when they're focusing on more successful projects, Valve has Steam, which is the number one gaming portal right now. So that's their emphasis. It's making them far more money letting that thing sit on the side and collecting all this revenue than doing something like this, where it takes 3 to 4 years, and you have to sell it for 50 to 60 bucks, and then all of a sudden to just get negative reviews and spend all those millions of dollars for it. It doesn't make much sense to do so these days. Especially this too. This is the last factor, and it has to do with this. Gaming today is more about pay to play than anything else. It's that weird world that I do not like, where it's more of here it is for free, but then if you want to get to a higher level, a quicker level, or a quicker method, then you have to start paying, and you have to start paying in little microtransactions. Some people like it, some people don't. I'm in the camp that I don't like it. So whenever that is the new emphasis these days, it makes a lot more money today than many other games. Why spend $10 million more on an original single player game when you could spend a fraction of that, probably a couple 100,000, and make a game that'll earn several times more because of pay to play? And that's all it is today. It's a lot of social games, games that are multiplayer, games that you could quickly just spend money on, and then that makes the makers more money. And if that's successful, why go back to an older model where there's a big chance of it failing? Of course, Half-Life wouldn't really fail if something like Half-Life 3 suddenly came out, but there's always still that chance. And I still think, yeah, it's just awkward to go about that, because it's just single player games are not really out there anymore, and that's essentially what Half-Life would be. The only hope I would have, and there's always rumors for it, is that Half-Life 3 or Half-Life Half-Life 2 Episode 3. It's a long title, I know, but I think the only hope I would have is if it's virtual reality. If it finally comes to a point where you could have those binoculars on, whatever those things are, those VR goggles, and then you get to experience Half-Life in person. That is how I feel Half-Life 3 would be the next step. So whatever happens, though, it'll be interesting to see, but I have no feeling, no indication, and this is me on a personal level, that this would ever come out. I think it left on a high note, in this case Half-Life 2 Episode 2, and ever since then, that's been it. There has been nothing else associated with it. Even the documentary itself stated it would be bad if it suddenly came out, because everyone's expectations would be much, much higher today than the actual result. And it's like almost doomed to be a negative stuff, because everyone would have different opinions as to what would be great. It's like The Force Awakens, the one that just came out the other year. So everyone had fantastic expectations for a new Star Wars film. Some people felt it hit the home run. Others felt that no, it missed their version of what it should have been fantastic, and that's why it's so divisive to this day. That's the same way I would feel if anything is released with Half-Life 3. But what do you guys think with regards to Half-Life, my special edition video here, 20 years later? What are your own thoughts? What was the first time you played it? What do you feel about Half-Life 3? Why do you think it was a success? Do you ever think it'll be back? And if so, what are your thoughts on how it should be coming back? Please post those comments below. It'd be really, really great to share them with everyone. So, all right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this special edition video of Half-Life 20 years later. Take care.